History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 162, Romeo and Juliet. These violent delights have violent ends. Last time in my journey through Shakespeare's plays, I looked at one of his least known history plays, King John. Following that episode, a listener on YouTube wondered if the grief expressed by Constance over the kidnapper and the anticipated death of her son Arthur might have been influenced by the death of Shakespeare's own son, Hamnet. Lines in her grief speech, like, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child," certainly cut deep. Hamnet Shakespeare died in August 1596, probably of plague. Without a precise date for the play, it's impossible to be certain about this, but the chances are that it was written just before those sad events. However, given the high levels of infant mortality of the time, Shakespeare must have been well aware of the effects of the death of young children on the people he lived with and worked with, even if he hadn't yet had personal experience of it. And so now we turn our attention to another play concerned with not the death of children, but nevertheless very young people, the star-crossed lovers of Romeo and Juliet. On this occasion, I'm not going to run through a synopsis of the plot because I'm pretty sure that you know it, but I will try to make sure that I mention where we are in the story when I discuss particular aspects of it. It is particularly challenging to talk about these very well-known plays because you will already have your own thoughts about them, and there is more to say about them than I can hope to cover in an episode of a reasonable length. So, on this occasion, I've decided to stick very much with the things that struck me about the play as I rewatched it and read it for the first time in several years. The dating of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is uncertain. The only direct clue in the text is when the nurse refers to an earthquake that happened 11 years ago. Of course, which earthquake that refers to is the question, and the line doesn't necessarily correspond to the year the play was written. Earthquakes are unusual in England, but one was recorded in the Dover Straits in 1580. This was a significant tremor which was felt from London well into northern France, and as it occurred during Easter week, it was considered to be particularly full of portent. So it's a reasonable guess that the line does indeed refer to that event. But perhaps Shakespeare was thinking about other quakes that had occurred in Italy, where they're much more common, and news of larger quakes would have reached London. Stylistic evidence, particularly the lyrical nature of the verse in the play, suggests that it is a close companion to A Midsummer Night's Dream, and the other plays from the early period of Shakespeare's work. The play was published in a quarto version in 1597. That first quarto edition has many deviations and omissions from the second quarto, printed in 1599, and it's thought to be possibly a pirated printing of the play constructed from the memory of audience members or actors. Another theory is that the quarto is a cut-down version produced by other companies or for small private performances after the premiere in the playhouses. The title page proclaims that the play has been often with great applause played publicly by the Right Honourable the Lord Hudson, his servants. Lord Hudson's men were renamed the Lord Chamberlain's men in March 1597, so printing of the quarto must have commenced before that date. We also know that the printer had his presses seized in early 1597, so it's very unlikely that the play could have been written any later than the end of 1596, but realistically, probably earlier than that. So it is possible that it was written as early as 1591, or any date after that before 1596. But if we're plumping for a date, then 1595 is as good as any around that time. That date also makes the 11 years since the Dover earthquake correct. Textual clues in the second quarto suggest that it was typeset from Shakespeare's manuscript or working papers, as it includes some anomalies in character names and some lines that appear to be rethought later but were included in the printing. This version is about 800 lines longer than the first quarto and was the basis for a 1609 third quarto, which is the version that was further corrected in minor ways for the first folio in 1623, and that is the basis for all later editions. The story has its origins in tragic romances that stretch back into antiquity, but the direct source for Shakespeare was The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet by Arthur Brooke. This was an English translation of an Italian story by Matteo Bandello. He was a Dominican friar who lived from about 1480 to 1562 and wrote about 200 novellas and short stories, making him one of the most prolific authors of his time. Brooke's translation, which also included Shakespeare's material for Two Gentlemen of Verona, was published in 1652 and was then retold in a prose version by William Paynter in 1567, which was published in a collection of his translations. It also seems very likely that Shakespeare borrowed from Ovid's Pyramus and Thisbe, some aspects of which are paralleled in the play. The hatred between the parents of the two lovers and the way in which Pyramus believes Thisbe to be dead seem particularly close to Shakespeare's retelling in the play, and given his well-known admiration of Ovid throughout his work, it seems unthinkable that this would not have been in his mind while he was crafting his own version of this old and well-known tale. Some analysis has suggested that the work of Xenophon of Ephesus, who was writing in the 3rd century CE, might also have been a source. His story in the Ephesiasia includes lovers kept apart and a death-like sleep induced by a potion, but of course we don't know for sure that Shakespeare was aware of this work. The story and some of the characters can be traced back through Italian literature, some of which Shakespeare likely would have known. The names Capulet and Montague appear in their Italian form in Dante's Divine Comedy, where he uses a reference to feuding families to make critical statements about Italian and papal politicians. One of the families in that story were from Verona, but Shakespeare strips them of their political context, just picking up on the names. There were other notable Italian versions of the story of Romeo and Juliet, published in 1476 and 1531. The earlier of which bears fewer similarities to the play, but the 1531 version by Luigi da Porto includes the Montague and Capulet names, as well as Tybalt, Mercutio and Juliet's nurse, which then get carried into later versions to one degree or another. When Arthur Brooke came to write his English version, he was part of a trend for translating Italian stories into English, something that Shakespeare was also party to with this play and The Merchant of Venice, All's Well That Ends Well, and Much Ado About Nothing. These were all taken from stories translated from Italian at about that time. Brooke augmented his translation by borrowing from Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside, particularly with the influence of fate on the plot. Shakespeare retained that, and also borrowed some of the same imagery that Brooke had borrowed from Chaucer. Shakespeare also follows Brooke, rather than the other versions of the story, by making the final death of the lovers sequential rather than concurrent. By denying Romeo and Juliet last words together, the pathos of the ending is increased. What Shakespeare does uniquely is to steer away from the moralisation in Brooke's and other versions. These tend to feature the views of the Montague and Capulet elders very strongly, where they focus on the dishonest desires and disobedience of their children. Juliet, in particular, is shown to enjoy deceiving her mother and scheming with her nurse, and the deaths of Romeo and Juliet are shown as punishment for their sins. By contrast, Shakespeare focuses on the young lovers and elicits our sympathies to be with them and not their parents. This change in perspective is supported by the expanded roles that Shakespeare gives to the nurse, to Tybalt and to Mercutio. The play opens with a chorus introducing the action of the play. Interestingly, this only appears in the early quarto editions and was omitted from the first folio. That seems strange, as this opening sonnet that gives away the entire plot of the play includes some of the many best-remembered lines of the play. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which, but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. One intriguing theory is that when the play was first presented, Shakespeare was only known for comedies and historical dramas. By this time his only tragedy was Titus Andronicus, which was something quite of its own and not a tragedy in the way we now think of Hamlet or King Lear or any of the others. Anyone coming to see his Romeo and Juliet, even if they did know a version of the story, might have been anticipating a rather comic take on it, and most likely the traditional happy ending of a marriage on stage. The opening street brawl and the long-held grudges of the Capulet-Montague blood feud might have come as a bit of a surprise to an expectant audience, and that is before we get to the violence of the death of Tybalt and Mercutio and the teenage double suicide that ends the play. Perhaps it was felt that some explanation of what was to come was needed to prepare the audience, but by the time the first folio was published, Shakespeare's tragedies were well known, and Romeo and Juliet was grouped with them in the volume. The opening sonnet was by then superfluous, and therefore ditched. But of course, it's also possible that the sonnet was simply omitted by accident, or through the demands of space and time in the printing process. The degree to which Shakespeare opens the play with the dual emphasis on violence and the inevitability of the hand of fate is one of the things that I particularly noticed while rewatching the play recently. The famous reference to star-crossed lovers in the 6th line of the prologue, confirming that from the start the young lovers are doomed, and that sets the tone. Throughout the play, both Romeo and Juliet sense their approaching doom, referring to dreams of tombs and death, and referencing both in the context of marriage. In the end, it is the fateful non-delivery of a letter of instruction to the exiled Romeo that seals their fate, not directly the actions of their parents, the nurse, or even Friar Lawrence. The ever-present threat of violence is there from the first scene proper of the play, which introduces the blood feud and its main protagonists, the younger members of the two families. The root cause of the feud is never revealed, which adds to its all-consuming nature for those directly involved, and emphasising the hopelessness of the young lovers' situation and the completely unrealistic expectations of Friar Lawrence in his hope that young love can be the resolution to this problem. We hear some wordplay between the Capulets, Samson and Gregory, which soon turns crude and violent. They joke about violence and sexual arousal. "A dog of the house shall move me to stand. I will take the wall of any man or maid of Montague's." And they then add, "I will push Montague's men from the wall and thrust his maids to the wall." There is no way to take that other than a threat of rape. That threat of sexual violence to women is always present in the back and forth within and across the rival clans. As much as the boisterousness of youth does come across in what they would consider to be banter, particularly in that meted out by Mercutio, it is so much more serious and violent than that word suggests. One question here is, how much is this a version of Shakespeare's perception of the hot-blooded men of Verona, or does it in fact reflect the behaviour of young men around London? There is evidence of real concern about the behaviour of apprentices during their limited time off from work, and the potential for that to cause social unrest, and we know that the crowds in the playhouse were tied to that concern. Behaviours are no doubt exaggerated for effect in the play, but did the young men of London see themselves in these characters, and the older members of the audience see everything that they feared about the young armed men quarrelling in the street coming to life before their eyes? The aims of the feud may be ill-defined, perhaps even forgotten, and the two families very alike. As the chorus reminds us, they are both alike in dignity. But violence nevertheless erupts through mutual taunting and a hot-headed disregard for the Duke's instructions by Tybalt in particular. But fate is always present in the moment where lives are a sword's width away from death. There is a lack of control here, which the Duke does acknowledge as his failure in his final speech, but the leaders of the family tacitly and explicitly condone the behaviour of their kinsman. Again, the sense is perhaps that we are talking about contemporary London here as much as distant Verona. It is only the older women in the play, the Capulet and Montague matriarchs, who try to curb the enthusiasm for violence shown by their husbands and their sons. Not for the first time in Shakespeare, we have women as a voice of reason, although On this occasion, their pleadings are particularly unsuccessful. Lady Montague is reported as dead before she learns of the death of her son, and Lady Capulet, who herself has been invoking violence lately, sees her own end coming as she surveys Juliet's body. Oh me, this sight of death is as a bell that warns my old age to a sepulchre. The only young man who sits outside the feuding is Romeo himself. He just misses all of the action in the first brawl, and his absence is justified by his seeking solitude because of his melancholy state. Although he appears to understand the feud, he continues to remove himself from it directly because he is a different sort of youth. When he speaks to Benvolio, his language is full of statements that appear to fall over each other in contradiction. What fray was here? Yet tell me not, for I have heard it all. Here's much to do with hate, but more with love. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing first create, O heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep, that is not what it is. This love feel I, that feel no love in this. But at the heart of it, with the line, here's much to do with hate, but more with love, he points to the similarities between the clans rather than their differences, while in the speech as a whole he introduces himself as a Petrarchan lover, or maybe I should say shows himself as someone who is consciously trying to be a Petrarchan lover. He does this through the expression of desire in terms of its absence, of its unrequited nature, and its need to idolise the object of that love. It is a stance that would have been recognised by many in the audience as a type and a literary reference. Petrarch's many sonnets, the form he invented, expressing his love for the unobtainable Julia, and how her beauty, her very presence, felt like a physical wound to him, were still well liked and widely read a century or so after they were written. But Romeo is actually something of a fake Petrarchan. He takes on the poses and manners that are required to display true and pure love. This is in respect of Rosaline, who we never see, but is the object of Romeo's desires and the cause of his melancholy before he meets Juliet, and who he sees as unobtainable. Rosaline, like Juliet, is a Capulet, so just one reason why she is unobtainable to Romeo. It is a taboo that, unknown to him at the moment, he is about to break when it comes to Juliet. Benvolio and Mercutio seem to recognise the fakeness in Romeo when they search for him after the party, calling out, "Appear thou in likeness of a sigh, speak but one rhyme, and I am satisfied." Throughout the play, Romeo's speeches refer to Cupid and being struck by the god of love's arrow. We might say that Romeo is in love with the idea of being in love, and this is why he has no problem throwing over Rosaline for Juliet on first sight of her. Then he takes on another Petrarchan trait, that of performing superhuman deeds in the name of love. He climbs the orchard wall of Juliet's home, placing himself in a position of very real danger should he be discovered. He famously scales the building, in this case not a balcony, but almost certainly up towards the window above the tiring house at the back of the stage. The balcony was a much later addition to English architecture, and in the late 1500s there were no comparable structures in English homes. Romeo continues his Petrarchan view of the world as he climbs to her window. Comparing her to a celestial light is just one of the tropes that he employs. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. But then there is also, two of the fairest stars in all of heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars. So it all gets a bit over the top, and then it all starts to go wrong. Romeo's love is not unrequited. The pair are married and the marriage consummated. Within 4 days of the first scene of the play, both are dead. The Petrarchan model is abandoned. Death is the result. So, is Shakespeare moralising, something he singularly does not do over the rest of the play, or actually ridiculing the idea of Petrarchan love? Is the play a romantic story of love at first sight, or a cautionary tale for young people with unrealistic expectations and uncontrolled desire. At the points where Romeo does meet up with his kinsman, he can understand their banter and partly join in with it, but also recognisably holds himself aloof from it. The closest he comes to rejoining the feud is when Mercutio is killed by Tybalt. Grief and perhaps guilt cause him to forget his usual passivity and rage after Tybalt. Guilt because Mercutio took up a challenge that was actually addressed to Romeo, making Romeo complicit in his death. When dying, Mercutio asks, "Why the devil came you between us? I was hurt under your arm." But then Romeo appears to shift the blame onto Juliet, saying of her that, "Thy beauty hath made me effeminate, and in my temper softened valour's steel." But in his banishment, he remains in the Petrarchan mould, only wanting most fervently to hear of Juliet's well-being, and apparently about to rhapsodise over their enforced separation, until he understands that they are now separated by the grave. This view of Romeo's role in the play serves to flesh out a character who in many ways does not drive the plot as much as Juliet does. She is, I think, the most extraordinary character in the play, who takes on the role that is subversive, manipulative, and, to the Elizabethan mind, deeply immoral. It is made very clear that she is very young and of a class where her role was to marry well and advance the family by so doing. She has, we hear, rarely been out of the family home alone except for church and confession, and otherwise always in the care of her parents or nurse. Nothing so strange in that at the time, when a woman's place and identity were almost exclusively expressed in terms of her marital status and in relation to male authority figures. When obedience, chastity and deference were considered the most desirable female traits, the very young Juliet seems to be a very innovative character. We've seen powerful female figures on the stage before, but they tend to be wives or mothers of kings, victims, or portraits that verge on caricature. Shakespeare would come to craft many great but subversive female roles, and Juliet is the first in that lineage. It is a profound moment when she calls for night to hurry onward so that her husband she has illicitly married can come to her. "Come, gentle night, come loving black-borrowed night, give me my Romeo." We rarely see Juliet out of her bedchamber, which emphasises her isolation as a young woman, especially when it is contrasted with the young men who roam town freely in gangs or in pairs. Yet she instigates many of the key plot points. She willingly kisses Romeo on their first meeting and then invites him to find a way to visit her later. She is immediately open to the idea of a deceitful marriage and works with Friar Lawrence on the plans. Here we have societal fear of uncontrolled female desire writ large. The fact that she prefers Romeo to Paris not only confirms the idea that the female gaze will inevitably wander, but sets her up in direct opposition to her father's wishes. She even plays the traditional role of the father of the bride by making herself responsible for the marriage. It is not so much Romeo persuading Juliet into marriage, but the other way around. Juliet is in the lead here when she says to Romeo, "If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word to-morrow by one I'll procure to come to thee, where and what time thou wilt perform the rite, and all my fortunes at thy foot I'll lay, and follow thee, my lord, throughout the world." Perhaps it was Juliet's behaviour that shocked the original audience's sensibilities the most, not the behaviour of the boisterous youths or Romeo's Petrarchan posturing. In our more liberated times, the play sits more comfortably in the romantic love story mould, because generally speaking, we do not see Romeo and Juliet's behaviour as so reprehensible as their parents and the rest of Veronese society do. But in its own time, Juliet's behaviour in particular stands out as against all of the cultural norms. But for all of this analysis of character, motivation and setting, I would not want to ignore the sheer lyrical romantic beauty of the poetry in the play. Although there are many poetic passages that are rightfully very well known, if I'm forced to pick one as an example, I think it has to be the sonnet that Romeo and Juliet jointly speak at their first meeting in Act 1, Scene 5. This is at Capulet's party, where Tybalt has already recognised Romeo and singled him out for punishment for being so bold as to appear as a guest. And then immediately after this moment of tension and Tybalt's exit, Romeo takes Juliet by the hand. First, here is the passage. It won't sound so special with me reading both parts, so do look it up and hear it spoken as part of the play as well. Romeo. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, this gentle sin is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that soft touch with a tender kiss. Juliet. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Romeo. Have not saints lips and holy palmers too? Juliet. Ay, pilgrim lips that they must use in prayer. Romeo. O then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Juliet. Saints do not move, though grant of prayer's sake. Romeo. Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. He kisses her. Thus from my lips, by thine, my sin is purged. Juliet. Then have my lips the sin that they have took. Romeo. Sin from my lips? O trespass sweetly urged. This sonnet works on several levels and is a great example of how Shakespeare could merge the poetic and the theatrical so that as a piece of theatre they become greater than the sum of their parts. Prior to this, the party scene, including the anger of Tybalt and Capulet's attempts to calm him, has been noisy, boisterous and slightly comic. Suddenly, we get this moment of quiet tenderness, where the soon-to-be lovers are in a world of their own. Then, the sonnet itself, as spoken by both Romeo and Juliet, serves to emphasise their closeness and suggest compatibility despite their familial divisions. The rhyme scheme of the sonnet usually runs AB, AB in the first quatrain and CD, CD in the second. But here, Shakespeare alters that normal form to AB, AB, followed by CB, CB. Juliet repeats Romeo's line ending this and kiss, so that both rhythmically and lexically they are becoming entwined. That is then further emphasised as they each take an alternate line of the third quatrain before he kisses her, and they then conclude by taking one line each of the closing couplet. In several productions that I've seen, this moment never fails to express a huge emotional pull. It is a real theatrical moment because of the cleverness of the writing. Not that anyone sitting watching there is thinking about that, but simply enjoying the moment. Although Romeo and Juliet dominate the play, there are two other characters that really stand out, Juliet's nurse and Friar Lawrence. Both, but particularly the nurse, have provided great roles for actors over the years. Both play instrumental parts in allowing the young lovers to perform their nonconformist relationship, and we have to wonder why these two older characters in identifiable roles in society are so willing to provide that aid. For Friar Lawrence, it's an easier question to answer. He explicitly says that enabling the illicit marriage will provide a bridge by which the two families can become reconciled and the blood feud ended. That is at least a good reason, however unrealistic we think his hopes may be. He too, we think, is a hopeless romantic or inexplicably naive, and he cannot have any real understanding of the cause of such a long-standing feud. Despite being a somewhat at least learned monk, he's happy to make potions and poisons and dish them out to young people. His mistake is to hang on to his belief in the power of this marriage in the face of everything that goes wrong with his plan. In the end, his willing confession to his part in the tragedy is his only saving grace, but still, many will hope the Duke deals harshly with him. The motivation of the nurse is a somewhat tougher question. She has been Juliet's primary carer since birth. Nothing in Lady Capulet's manner or attitude suggests that she is physically or emotionally close to Juliet, and the nurse often expresses her wish for Juliet's happiness. She has a bawdy streak to her, and often refers to the physical manifestation of love, drawing an indistinct line between love and sex. She seems to have an idealised view of love in the early part of the play and has no problem with the idea of Juliet conducting an illicit relationship. For the plot, she acts as a messenger and even encourages Romeo not to give up on Juliet in the face of difficulties. She has a big turnaround in Act 3 when she says that Juliet should marry Paris, and by so doing she not only seems to abandon Juliet but condones bigamy, a condition viewed as a kind of incest in the Elizabethan mind, so an incredibly serious matter. This is in the face of Romeo's banishment, so we can conjecture that she sees the situation with Romeo as hopeless, and as Lady Capulet has promised to see him dead while in his banishment, the nurse sees a quick marriage to Paris as the best option to maintain Juliet's position. Whatever we feel about her motivations, there has been a general agreement that she is an affectionately drawn character who bristles with life and insights into the life of the everyday Elizabethan. She is unstoppably chatty as she reminisces about Juliet's childhood and her own deceased daughter and husband. We might think the nurse's influence at times malign, but like many of Shakespeare's characters from the lower classes, we do like her. One of the real strengths of Romeo and Juliet is the way that Shakespeare manages to combine a fast-moving plot with moments of poetic genius. Whereas his sources place the story playing out over months, Shakespeare chose to condense the action into just a few days. Underlined by frequent references to the passing of time, and punctuated by the 3 interventions by the Duke, Shakespeare still managed to find space for lengthy and descriptive poetry without losing the sense of pace. Although we have no record of performances before the Restoration, the frequent publication of quarto editions suggests that Romeo and Juliet must have been popular from its first production until the closure of the theatres. In 1622, the play was presented in London, but found to be out of tune with the times with its fusion of the comic and the tragic. Samuel Pepys noted in his diary that it was "the worst that ever I heard in my life." As was common then, the play was rewritten to give it a happy ending, but interestingly, when this was produced, the original tragic ending was played on alternate nights. Later adapted versions retained the tragedy, but included final words between the lovers as they lay dying. Through the 1700s, the actor-managers took on the leading roles in their own adaptations, some of which removed bawdy references and archaic language, and replaced it with spectacle and pageantry. In 1750, both patent theatres in London produced the play at the same time, and each maintained a 12-night run. This in the days when a 3-night run was considered a success. Both theatres brought the play back regularly, and it was, during the 18th century, the most frequently performed Shakespeare play. In the early 19th century, there was a fashion for Romeo to be played by a woman, something that has, as far as I'm aware, not been attempted in recent times as gender-swapping roles has become popular. Typically, actresses have had greater success playing Juliet than actors have with playing Romeo. It is a role with which young actresses can be seen to burst onto the scene. And the nurse's role has also provided meat for older actresses, more than Friar Lawrence has for their contemporaries. John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier alternated the roles of Romeo and Mercutio in a famous production in London in 1935. And that is really a very brief summary, even before we get onto the filmed and adapted versions by Franco Zeffirelli, Baz Luhrmann, and of course West Side Story. Romeo and Juliet continues to resonate because people continue to experience familial conflict and disapproval of romances, and, I assume, always will. Here they are in this play, set out before us and writ large. The play is easy to respond to because despite the exotic setting and underlying violence in the play, we can all empathise with the strength of the feeling of young love and the feeling that all young lovers have much to overcome. In our own small ways, most, if not all of us, have experienced that, and as retold in this pacey and simple storyline, some timeless and universal truths are revealed. This is all done through some exquisite poetry that speaks to us in immediate, even urgent ways, making this a play of truly universal appeal. Next time, As I've mentioned, the ongoing popularity of Romeo and Juliet has made it a play that in itself has influenced culture, and at whatever end of the cultural spectrum you choose. So next time I'll be continuing with Romeo and Juliet as I look at the ongoing influence and cultural effect of this much-loved play. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.